just a few weeks ago, that budget proposal came under scrutiny in a U.S. Senate hearing. And we looked at the hearing and we noticed that Senator Daines was not part of that hearing. And then we got word that he was actually attending, and I've got the invitation right in front of me. He was attending a political fundraiser instead. And that's the sort of thing that we get wind of, and we want to call attention to it, because at the end of the day, we expect our elected leaders to do the work of the people, because we are the bosses, right? We pay their salaries. We expect them to do that, especially if they're going to make political hay with this stuff, to be part of those discussions and not attending fundraisers instead.
Right.
So basically what happens is there's an effort to cut that money.
Yeah.
Where does it go?
Goes back to the Treasury. It can be spent on all sorts of different things.
Right. And at a time where they want to increase offshore drilling, thereby increasing revenues going into the fund,
Right.
they want to take the money out of what it was originally intentioned for.
Yep. And I would add, it still is a pretty darn good deal, because this was in 1965, $900 million.
Yeah.
That is not the same as a dollar's rate like today.
Right.
So,
Right.
So, as is usually the case in Congress, the president proposes a budget. It's usually awful. They amend it, usually upward, not always, but very often upward. That's common. But if you have a very low base, the compromise, so to speak, is still not anywhere near where you want it to be. So you're trying to set the pattern.
Right,
and
exactly.
saying,
And again, this bill that is working its way through Congress now is a very good bill, because it would dedicate and fund $900 million per year. Again, we celebrate that. We think that's a very good step.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's not a miracle move. It's not a heavy lift. It is simply doing what Congress expects you to do. So we say thank you, but we also say, all right, now let's keep going.
Right.
We've got more
why
work to
is
do.
it stalling, though?
Good question. That is a probably better question for the folks who control the Senate's agenda, and there's all sorts of things at stake right now. And the good news is there are enough people, lawmakers, who are co-sponsoring this bill, bipartisan, which is fantastic, to probably just muscle this thing through and get it passed and signed into law ASAP.
Mm-hmm. Your biggest muscle, then, is the fact that they all know people want this.
Right. I think it says a lot that Senator Steve Daines and U.S. Senator from Colorado, Senator Cory Gardner, both of whom are up for re-election this year, got behind this bill. And the president tweeted a few weeks ago that he supported this bill, even after recommending decimating it in his budget proposal. Nonetheless, we think all of this is happening because we're doing okay holding them accountable to it. When we spell this out for people in Montana who have the power to vote, people know that public lands, for example, transcends partisan politics, as it should.
Right.
Senator Daines likes to say he supports public lands. Great. That's great for a candidate to tell constituents. Our job is to make sure it's not just rhetoric, that the record matches it. That's where we come in.
Yeah.
Right.
The fig leaf approach. Which,
Bingo.
Yep.
Right. And it's also, I mean, I think these politicians should start ending that sentence, finishing that, make it more complete. Like, I support public lands for outdoor recreation,
Right.
or I support public lands because there's all kinds of resources there that we should develop.
Right.
Right. And so right now, I think that vagary, especially from the GOP, leaves people uninformed about what their real intentions are.
Well, and you don't have to look far back to see that Senator Daines just a few years ago, and Congressman Gianforte, the bills were slightly different, but they introduced legislation to take the ambiguity out of what are called wilderness study areas and basically release them from their status as de facto wilderness areas. Interesting concept, but we were scratching our heads because those bills were introduced without public input, and the public made themselves heard loud and clear. And when Senator Daines would listen, which wasn't very often because he doesn't like to hear from constituents in person, but it's notable that both of them tried to do that, which, by the way, would open those lands up for development. they haven't been reintroduced. And so I think that says a lot about where things stand.
I
Yeah.
would say another particular tie for this, too, is William Perry Penley heading up BLM,
Yeah.
and Senator Daines continuing to say that he has not been given a reason to be against him. Well, this man has been opposed to public lands for a very long time. We have the record on that. That is something that he made his money off of as a lawyer, etc. And the fact is he also, on a different podcast in Montana, but did say, my job is to think about developing all the land. Well, guess what? He is starting to do that, and we've already seen 650 acres disappear, basically, before our eyes, because there was a deal around Lewistown that opened up another 650,000 acres for oil and gas.
Right, and it's important to note that William Perry Penley is not the director of the BLM; he's the acting
Acting director,
and he
right.
hasn't been confirmed by the Senate, which I think is part of the strategy of this administration, right? To
Yes.
Right.
basically pop people in. They're not necessarily accountable to elected leaders who are supposed to confirm these positions, and he gets very defensive when you say, "Well, you've got a pretty awful record when it comes to public lands." The record speaks for itself. I mean, we didn't make these words up; he said them, and so when Senator Daines says something to the effect of, "Well, I haven't found a reason to be against him," well, we've got lots of them. All you have to
Right.
do is look at the facts.
It doesn't take long.
Yeah,
And he just got extended another 3 months as of January,
right.
which prompted us to organize a letter, make sure the Montanans knew that, and we're still waiting for a response from Senator Daines and Congressman Gianforte.
Yeah, I hope people understand what you're talking about, because this is an issue a lot of people care about, preserving our lands. The BLM is in charge of a Bureau of Land Management, right? It's a very important piece of that puzzle. And you're talking about, as they like to do, put somebody in that position whose job is to destroy the agency.
250 million acres are managed by William Perry Penley. That should scare everyone.
That's terrifying. Yeah.
And what you're also talking about is actually complacency and or actually conspiracy to go along with that. They know who he is.
Oh, right. Exactly
You
right.
know.
Yep, exactly right. And the problem that we see, and this is just an observation as an American citizen, but there's so much other news that happens every day, from the president's
Right.
Twitter feed, that it's little things like this, which are not little things. They're very big things, but they tend to get swept under the rug, and we move on. And, we haven't even caught our breath from yesterday's news. And
Exactly.
we're making new news, and here the BLM is very
and meanwhile,
quietly...
yeah, right, in the
yeah.
background, there's all these things that are happening,
Right.
and they all build on themselves.
That's
so
right. That's right.
it's
They count on that.
It's a real threat. Yeah. Let's talk about Steve Bullock entering the Senate race,
Yeah.
and how's that going to affect your agenda?
Well, I should start by saying, again, he is endorsed by MCV, so just a full disclosure there. Again, we invited all Senate candidates, regardless of political party, to seek our endorsement, and he earned it. Also worth noting that he was endorsed by MCV in his previous runs for governor and has been a champion for conservation. And as Whitney noted a little earlier, has been the backstop to some pretty awful pieces of legislation that have come out of the legislature. And to that end, we are very proud to stand behind him, again, not as a Democrat, but as a conservation advocate. That's why we endorsed him. And I think he is a very popular governor. I would note that when tens of thousands of Montanans voted for Donald Trump in 2016, they also voted for Steve Bullock. And that speaks volumes to the electorate in this state, that they are willing to look at people over a political party. And when you match that with his conservation record, it's something that we're very excited about. And again, I think it's also good for everybody, because what it's doing is holding Senator Daines, his chief opponent, who's the incumbent, accountable to his own record. So now Senator Daines can't just get away with saying, "Oh, I support public lands." Well, now you have to prove it, because
Right.
Governor Bullock already has. And we want to make sure that conservation, particularly public lands, becomes a front and center issue, because there is a huge difference of records between those two candidates. So it's our job to make sure that people go to the ballot box with that information in mind, and that they know who is good at rhetoric and who is good at record.
Right.
How do you intend to deliver that message advertising or?
That's one strategy, and we plan to do that. We plan to have boots on the ground. People go door to door and make sure people are aware of the candidates and the facts that we are behind. We plan to do it through voter education, through email, through social media. And I think to that end, we are currently raising the money necessary to do that sort of thing. And there is a lot of interest all of a sudden in this race because with no disrespect to the other candidates who have bravely put their name forward, Steve Bullock has name recognition. People know who he is. He's popular among Democrats and Republicans and independents. And that's what this state is made up of, mostly independents. So we're excited about the prospect of adding another conservation champion who is really a champion to the Senate. But again, I want to separate that from the political party he belongs to because we're a nonpartisan organization.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a difficulty for you to convince people that you are not actually partisan.
Right.
If you had a conservative who was really interested in conservation, that would be great.
Right.
I think the perfect example of that is Ryan Zinke, our former congressman and the former Secretary of Interior.
Yep.
When he was in the state legislature, we did endorse him. He had one of the best records for conservation, and then all of a sudden, as soon as he left the state, he forgot what that meant. And so we did flip the switch on him, and we did some very strong accountability. But I think that is recent history. That shows that we are nonpartisan. That shows that it is about conservation, and it's about what actions you're taking versus just lip service.
Right. I would add to that, we invite everybody who is running for public office to come into our tent, which is, we're not just talking about lofty principles here. We're talking about saving the earth.
Right.
We're talking about future generations. That is not a partisan issue for us.
Right.
But we are also not going to pretend that, we're going to endorse a candidate just because that candidate belongs to a certain party, so we appear bipartisan. No, they're welcome to come to us and say, look, this is important to me regardless of the party I belong to. I want your endorsement. We will absolutely have that conversation, and we welcome it, and we wish there was more of it. Unfortunately, it seems that most of the candidates we endorse belong to one party only, and I think that's a sad state of affairs, but it's not something that we're going to lower our standard for.
It wasn't
Right.
always true either.
Yeah.
30 years ago, there were a lot more
Oh,
conservatives who were into conservation.
right. And I think most people in this state who consider themselves independents and might consider themselves leaning more to the right, those are people who share the same values we do. They care about clean water for their kids. They care about the
Exactly.
places their dad took them hunting 30, 40 years
Exactly.
ago. That's what we care about. And then oftentimes we are labeled as, a quote unquote dark money organization or a partisan organization. That is false. We are not a partisan organization. We simply care about electing people who are true to their word.
Right. Or radical environmentalists. I like that one. Although I think one could hardly say that Montana Conservation Voters is a radical organization, since I'm sure you have to compromise a lot on a
Right.
lot of the issues that you're working on.
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, Dixie, because one of the things that's very important to us is, in order to affect change, you have to win those elections. And so we look at viability, the ability for a candidate to win, because without being able to win and be in that position of power, it is very hard to move the needle. So sometimes that means where we end up is a little more in the middle. And that's important. So we are not, I don't consider us radical at all. In fact, there are plenty of organizations out there who think we're too far to the right for them. They're welcome to believe that, but at the end of the day, for us, it comes down to who we think is the best person to represent us on the issue of conservation.
Let me take a difficult issue. Okay, right now we've been talking about land use, which I think you get a huge amount of agreement about in the United States, and particularly in Montana. But climate change, climate emergency is a more controversial issue, even here in Montana. And politically, it's a more difficult issue. I'm sure it is. How do you handle that? What is your stance on climate, and how do you handle that?
Right. And we're starting to use the term climate breakdown because it really, we're past the point of
Right.
acknowledging this as change. This is a fundamental change that that, by the way, young people are really paying attention to, I should note. I was sitting at a table with a bunch of young women a few months ago, very engaged. We were at an event, and I just out of curiosity asked them who they were supporting for president. This was months ago, so the field was bigger then, but they all said Jay Inslee. I said, that's interesting. Well, Governor Inslee of Washington State, his sole issue when he was a presidential candidate was climate change. And that was very telling to me. I mean, these were probably 18 to 19-year-old women, and all of them wanted to support, Jay Inslee of Washington. That tells me a lot. But what I would say is, to answer your question, we want to make sure that people understand this is an economic issue. And Whitney mentioned that earlier and can touch on it further. But in 2016, not all that long ago, the river running right outside here was shut down to fishing because a whole bunch of fish went belly up from proliferative kidney disease, and it caused them to die, and the governor shut down the river. A huge bite to the economy. That wasn't just because of some random accident. That was caused by climate change. A year later, we saw the most devastating wildfires in Montana's history. It was so bad, the street lights came on because the air was so thick with smoke. That's not an accident. That is climate breakdown happening. And it affected our economy. There were plenty of people who canceled their summer vacations to Yellowstone and to Glacier because you couldn't see across the street. That's something that everybody should be paying attention to. It's not us making up facts. It's us living in the same world as you do.
I'd also add that we've been very supportive of Governor Bullock's Climate Solutions Council. We've actually got a couple of our board members that are participating on that. Although I think some people would say it's late to the game because he is rolling down his term, at the same time, I think it's really hopeful because it's bringing people together from divergent, different views and coming up with ideas that hopefully, with the right governor taking that place, we will really be able to make some difference with.